All right, cool. We are live, and this is the second week, or part two, of going through the well-grounded Rubyist. Something I've been wanting to do for a while. Like I said in the last video, you were able to catch up, doing every 2 weeks, because we're actually setting the goal of doing 4 chapters every 2 weeks. And my personal goal was to read this book months ago, but I never got around to it. So I'm kind of just bootstrapping my way through it and recording these videos to kind of help myself learn. But if anybody else is also out there who wants to read or learn from this book, that's why I'm recording these videos, and more than likely we'll continue to just do this with a number of Ruby books that I have that I'd like to get through. So if you watched any of the Ruby newbie videos, or if you've seen me around, that's my name, and that's my Twitter handle. And like I said, I am no expert. I've said this in the past. I'm no expert in Ruby. I've been doing it for a little bit, but Ruby is actually my first language, so there's still a learning curve for some things, which hopefully this book will kind of help me get through. And also with anybody else who wants to get through this, this book is an excellent tool for getting to know Ruby really well. I didn't add this slide. I added the slide later. I didn't do the slide last time, but how to read this book. I just wanted to point out that as I was reading this book, I kind of realized that this book it's a tons of concepts and ideas on Ruby and how to use it. And I guess a lot of people, and I had this issue with learning Objective-C in iOS, is I try to sit and learn and make sure I know something really well, which that's the wrong way to go about it. It's basically, I'd recommend just going through the concepts and reading through the book, and if you don't understand everything, don't spend days or hours trying to understand and research that one topic. I suggest just move on to the next topic and then plan for going through the book again and really focusing on that the second time around. Because I found that, especially programming books, you're not going to catch everything the first time around when reading. Actually, over the weekend I read 2 books, actually a large chunk of 2 books, one being Eloquent Ruby and the other one being Eloquent JavaScript. And I just found that I was learning quite a bit, even though it was a lot of repeated information for me. I felt like reading it a second time go around, you tend to find more stuff the second time. So my idea is to take down questions or stuff that might not be understood very well, and then go through it again at a future date after you've gone through the entire subject matter. But that's my 2 cents. I mean, anybody can go through it any way they want, but I highly recommend doing it that way. So with that being said, we are going to start, and I just had mentioned this last week. I will throw in some extra ideas and notes as we go through the chapters, just as an extra help. I don't have too much extra information. Just a lot of the information was kind of packed in the first 2 chapters of this 4-chapter section. The last 2 sections, it was just more reiterated information that, for me, that I felt like you probably got elsewhere also. That's just my assumption. So, the default object self, this is chapter 6. We went through, it's actually not chapter 6, it's actually chapter 5. I need to fix that. Yeah, because we went through under 4, so yeah, that should be 5. So, yeah. But I put a little note in myself in the notes about self, and if you think of self as the same way you look at a compass, and every time if you're going sailing or if you're hiking, you always want to find out where that true north is. Self is kind of like taking a look, just like this person's looking in the mirror, and kind of readjusting where you are within the code. So, and sometimes you need to call self to make sure that things are within the, well, I'm kind of explaining more, but things that were within the scope and are visible to whatever objects you're trying to call methods on, or variables. But we'll get in more detail on that. But I just thought of, when I was reading this, I just thought of kind of like a compass. I actually thought about that this morning, so I didn't really have more detail into that thought to go into more detail on that, but we'll just jump right in. So self, before even reading this book, I actually was recommended this book because the chapter on self and scope and visibility it's actually a pretty beefy chapter. It's actually it might have been like 40 pages, but it goes in really great detail on how self works and thinking about how calling objects based on self and scope. And it kind of gives you a really good understanding. I actually had a peer at work ask me a question about a method he wrote that was not being called correctly. And the reason was because he was trying to call a method on a method. And when you try to call a method on a method, it doesn't quite work that way unless you kind of understand where the scope is. So he wasn't, as far as scope itself, I just gave him the recommendation of adding self to the beginning of his method. And this kind of explains a little more. If you look at so self is a default receiver of messages. So with that being said, look at class player, and there's a method inside the class called walk. Well, when you call the walk method, self.walk is implied. So a lot of times you could either leave it out or implicitly call it. I think within the best practices, they actually recommend you call self for walk. So you'll call self.walk. So if you were to call another method, like we see walk faster, you would actually want to rather type self.walk faster. Not only is it easier to understand what's going on and where the walk is implied, to implicitly state self. It's a good practice. Again, I said the book that I read was Eloquent Ruby. It's a great book, and actually I do recommend it, and I have a link later in the within the essentials. But it's actually basically all best practices for Ruby. So with Ruby, you kind of get a lot of different ways to do different things, and sometimes just too many ways to do one thing. And Eloquent Ruby kind of organizes your thoughts and kind of pushes you into a position into doing it the same way other people do it. Which, with that being said, there's no reason for you not to do it any way you want it to do. But when it comes to working with teams or other people reviewing your code or assisting you, it kind of helps to have that best practices in play, so that way everybody knows what's going on. So that's it about self. I wanted to try something different and not actually give all the information from the book, because I know that kind of discounts the author of the book. In going through, I kind of had a really, really in-depth slides for each section of the book. So I'm actually going to keep these slides a little slimmer. But yeah, we can always talk about, and also Horvath, if you want to interrupt me and if you want to discuss something more deeper as far as this.
No, it's clear. The book gives a really good explanation on this.
And you know, the thing about this explanation too, I didn't read the book prior to actually learning JavaScript last week, actually learning jQuery a little more, and there's an explanation for this, which is similar to self within JavaScript or jQuery, and it kind of helped me understand it even more, helped me understand this because I understood how self worked with Ruby. So in JavaScript, this works very, very much the same way. So, but with scope, scope's something that's actually not going to go away if you move to another language like Ruby or JavaScript or anything, PHP, Perl. Scope is all about where you are within the code base. So scope refers to reaching the visibility of identifiers, specifically variables and constants, interactions based on the scope of those objects. So if you remember how last week we talked about using the include call on modules, you had to have access to other variables within that module. Scope is very much like that. So you would not have access to certain stuff in the math module, or you couldn't have access to the mathpy function unless you included that within your scope by calling that include callback. Yeah, but I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's going through self. It's just about the same thing. So if you, every now and then I find myself writing a method where I'll call in a regular variable, but I'll actually have to make an instance variable. And with that being said, instance variables, I think, No, we didn't go over it last time. It actually goes over this section. But instance variables are basically just as what they are. They're instances of that data. So that v instance right here, we've got I am the instance variable initialized to a string. That instance will be called just after you can print that, and then outside that method show variable or show var, then you could also you could print that same variable, but if you see, they reset the variable to a new string, so that way you can actually call that instant variable again. So you can rename variables outside that scope with instant variables, and similar with class variables or global. Actually, just class variables. They're if you I won't even explain it because nobody that I've seen actually uses class variables, but they're signified with a double at sign. And then there's also global variables, which is another variable that it's not really recommended in the Ruby best practices to use because you start needing to worry about deprecation and updating global variables in order for them not to conflict in different parts of your code. So as far as best practices, I think they're kind of frowned upon if you use global or class variables. But just keep in mind that's another way to break outside the scope and not have that to be a worry within your programming. And then there's a great explanation of the summary. I just went backwards. There we go. Yeah. So yeah, the summary scope, which we have here. And it's just a basic explanation. It just shows where everything's called and how everything's accessed. So I won't go step by step through what's going on within this image, but just note that I know within Rails controllers and views, I had a lot of trouble when I first started learning Rails and actually calling instant variables properly. Honestly, I didn't really understand the difference between instance variables and regular variables. So I wrote everything without the @ sign just because I thought it looked better. And I had a lot of issues trying to pull in that information within my view. So if I had going back to my church app, I had just trying to find churches. I wasn't able to display a list of churches. I was only able to actually get an uninitialized constant error. So I had to switch that to an instance variable. Just little things like that. If you kind of think about scope and think about going back to that compass thing, knowing where you are within your application, you won't have issues with that. Actually, you probably still will have issues. You'll have issues no matter what in programming, but hopefully that will help debug issues a lot faster. So with that being said, we're going to move on. That was more of a beefier section. This section is just as...
Yeah, can I have a question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about right now constants.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's the rule for that? Maybe it's gonna be later on the book, but it just got me thinking that maybe a lack of my programming knowledge, but how do you access constants?
So constants is actually, so I did say nobody uses global variables. Constants are actually a little more like a global variable.
Yeah, I was thinking the same, but
so I guess
could it be that they are used within a class? I'm just thinking that we wrote back then Java codes and the constants was inside classes.
Okay, yeah. Usually constants, constants actually, they're like global variables, but they actually will have issues within calling with inside. I think they're more, I'll make a note on that to look up constants. I think it comes up later in the book.
Yeah, I'm sure about this. It just got me thinking right now.
But I can't remember if constants, if they act more like instance variables or they act like global variables on what the difference is.
Yeah, that's my problem too. Just got me thinking. How should I think about them?
A lot of the I'm trying to think because constants are kind of like treated, since I deal with Rails more throughout the day. Constants seem like they're more affected when you're calling like more inheritances.
Mm-hmm.
for the controllers, or if you're calling methods within different controllers, I believe those are acted just as constants. But I don't know. I can't have something I have to look into. I don't know the answer for sure, but that's a good question that I definitely want to know the answer to. So I might look it up later tonight and maybe put like a little explanation on it, or if not tomorrow morning. But actually, it would actually even be a good blog post that they work with. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I'll get back to you on that one because I actually want to know the answer to that.
Cool, thank you.
Um, but yeah, we were so moving on to the next section, the next chapter. It's just all about control flow techniques, and if you did Java or you did anything like that, programming. This is basically the base knowledge of all programming. If statements, case statements. And there's a couple questions that I've looked into. So if for those who don't know or didn't really grasp the concept, if you just think of if this then that, or just how programs are all based on zeros and ones. You're basically just trying to find out if something is true or false. Um, that's basically it for now. So there's no more explanation there. We can go through that because my assumption is that most people have gone through that basic foundation of programming or Ruby before starting to watch this or read this book. But if not, they do go through that in more detail. But then I had some questions just that I've always kind of had in my mind when I first, that kind of hung me up within programming. Um, with one being, actually, I do want to put a question mark in that one. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, like some questions like when would I use case statements instead of an if else statement, or when do you use unless? And another question, when do you use the for loop or the while loop? There's quite actually a couple other loops that you could use, but it's kind of those questions are approaching problems and knowing what to use. It kind of paralyzes a programmer not knowing what the next step is, especially at beginner programming like myself. I didn't know what was the proper way to go about certain things, or I'd start writing code and then I'd see somebody else writing a for loop, and I would think, oh, that's probably the right way if someone else is writing a for loop. Um, but I basically answer those questions in one statement, and it's up to your team or who you're working with. If you're working your own, then you can write it whichever way you want it to write it, whichever way makes sense to you. Um, that's my recommendation, especially when you're first starting out. Just write it the way it makes sense to you. Don't worry about getting hung up on which way should I write it. As long as it's readable, and this is something that my mentor actually told me back in quite a few months ago. As long as it's readable and it's readable to you, and you can come back 6 months later and understand what's going on, then write it that way. But if that's not good enough answer for you, then there's also that book, Eloquent Ruby, available for you. It actually steers you towards best practices. So with Eloquent Ruby, they prefer if you're going to use unless, make sure unless is a one line instead of using unless, else, and then end. They prefer you to use unless if it's a one-line statement, because unless we actually just had a discussion at work whether to use unless or not for our code at work, and some people find it confusing. Some people love unless because you can write one-line if statements, but it's basically, again, it's all up to your team. Again, with the for and the while loops, is some people have preferences over that. They both work, but I know I don't think we have any while loops in our code. We do have for loops, but we actually do a lot of more enumerations using .each when we do loops. So that's another thing that comes up later, which I didn't mention because we actually have a whole chapter set for that. Another thing that reading Confident Code with Confident Ruby, they actually shy away from using case statements, but that's a whole other discussion. So. But yeah, it's all about best practices, and what you can read 6 months from now is probably the best thing. working on a team, I found firsthand that it's sometimes people can obstruct their code under some cleverness, and sometimes being clever for the sake of being clever, it could hurt you in the long run later, because you could probably forget what you were being so clever with and not really understand what's going on with the code. So there's some things to think about, and that's all this book is about, is kind of showing you the ropes and giving you some ideas of how to approach programming. So, so then moving to the last few chapters, we're actually going to go a little quicker, just because it's just more of the concepts repeated. I actually noticed that I thought this book was actually going to be a lot more beefier as we got along, but these next two chapters are actually a little skinnier in information. But just some of the built-in essentials, some things that make Ruby Ruby. A lot is syntactical sugar. This was a lollipop for obvious reasons, because it's sugar, and sometimes things in Ruby are just sweeter than other programming languages. For example, this is available in a lot of programming languages, but Ruby, you'll see a lot of things like this where you don't have to chain your methods. You actually use spaces between your methods, and even using the period to call your methods in arguments is not even necessary in some cases. So that's other things to think about when writing Ruby. But then you also want to keep up with, is it going to be readable in the future? So, but I won't go into more detail to that because the book goes into more detail. So Ruby offers a lot of niceties, which is not a word, but I kind of made it up because it made sense. Niceties to write your Ruby more eloquently. There's that word again in that book, kind of pushing that book. I actually read that book over the weekend. I was driving over to Tampa and had about an hour to kill because I wasn't driving. I was switching spots with my wife. And I actually read the first third of it. There's 3 parts in the book, similar to this book. And I read the first part in one sitting. So it's actually a quicker read than I thought it would have been. But I highly recommend that if you can pick up that book and you want to know more about how to write Ruby good. That's going to be a good book. And also Eloquent JavaScript's another good one that I read a third of also, or a quarter of. I think 4 parts, and I read the first part. So pretty good, and that book's free actually. So, but I didn't recommend it in the slides because it's not Ruby. So there's other things, more essentials, using the bangs. So it goes in more detail with what the bangs do, but it overwrites your variables, or your methods will overwrite using the bang method. A lot of times, sometimes it's not necessarily needed, but there are some cases where it is needed, or maybe you just want to write one less line of code, and it's nice to have that. Also conversions. So we have like the 2s, 2i that convert stuff to integers and to strings. Those are also available. I know Java has something very similar, maybe even the same lines, or it's the same wording. I'm not sure. I haven't actually written hardly any Java. It was a long time ago. I wrote an Android app, and that wasn't much Java at all. And then there's also the splat operator, which in order to take arguments, you're able to use the splat operator, which looks like this. Oh, there we go. If you wanted to have an argument, you can take multiple, just like that. So it comes in handy when you're doing some addition, if you want to do addition by. That's very interesting. If you wanted to add all numbers in an argument, it would look more like this. But I'm sure most of you guys have seen this before. I'm just kind of finding some stuff that probably doesn't need to be explained. But yeah, the splat operator, it comes in handy. Actually, it's very handy, but whenever I try to use it, I end up not using it because it's not necessary. So that's an interesting little thing. For whatever reason, every time I write small little Ruby programs, I don't end up using them, even though I'll start thinking I need to use it. That and the spaceship operator is another one. If you ever seen the spaceship operator, looks like that. I always start thinking I can use that in a program, and I always want to use it, but I never end up using it. It's never needed. So that's this little extra information, not really necessary. But then there's another, the last section I actually don't have any notes for, but it says again, it's the strings. Actually, I did have a slide. The slide actually is, I think it got deleted because I actually had a slide about appending strings, but I guess it didn't save. But you can check out the book. I apologize for that. I actually had an extra slide.
Well, you
Going
should
with that.
use the bang method.
Yeah. But yeah, but there's some appending that you can do in strings and Scholar objects. I don't have any more details on Scholar objects, but I think that has to do with the booleans. Um, it's it, they mention it in the title, but it's like one paragraph. They mention one paragraph in the actual chapter, so it kind of goes by. It's like a breeze. So I'm not sure what that term was. I'm gonna put a note to look up what that term is and add. I'm gonna add slides to this. The slides will be up later, and I'll have slides for that the end of this. But we'll go to Scholar objects. Yeah, that's it. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. Oh, you know what? For whatever reason, I added this to the end. So there's my string. So my slides are a little out of order. That's what happened. So yeah, there's my string. So you can interpolate strings within strings, which is pretty cool, and it could be really handy. I was just doing that earlier today with some translation files that I was doing for the Rails project that we're working on. But something that I didn't ever really use enough was probably interpolation of strings within my programming. Yeah, you could do that, and also with calling methods and classes, you can use string interpolation. It's a really cool tool, and I think a lot of languages have that, but this is the way Ruby implements it.
Yeah, and Ruby does it a really great way. If
Yeah,
anyone uses JavaScript or Java, it's horrible.
actually, I think every other language just does it pretty much similar, because I know Python.
Actually, PHP does it even greater
Oh, really?
because before every variable in PHP, you need to add a dollar sign, and in the string, you just wrote it with the dollar sign variable.
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
I think it's more easier. I'm not really into PHP, but I remember this.
Yeah. Yeah, I only have experience with that. So I did Objective-C and Ruby, obviously, JavaScript, and Python. And Python, Objective-C, and JavaScript all do it the same way where you use the interpolation percent. I'm not sure. I think JavaScript does something different, but something similar. You have a little, you'll have a placeholder, and then you set your arguments at the end outside the parentheses of the string. So that way.
Mm-hmm.
So Ruby has a very similar way of doing the way everybody else does it too, but I like the inline method and the storing that variable within the text. It's a lot. It's more readable, less to kind of think about. And when you come to like code and you're trying to catch up, if someone else is working on code and you're trying to help out, or you're working in a team, it's a lot easier when you don't have to go to different pages and find different information to try to figure out what's going on this one variable or string or class.
Uh-huh.
So with that being said, that is our conclusion of these 4 sections. It seems like this book is going to be pretty easy to get in 4 chapters in a row, and it will be no problem. So yeah, that's Ruby, and it helps Ruby's made to logically make sense, just like the whole string interpolation, and it helps in better understanding Ruby and its capabilities. So, highly recommend this book. If you haven't even read the book and you're just watching these videos in the future just to see if you should read the book, pay the $20 or whatever it is, $40. I only paid $17 because I use a coupon on Manning Publishing, which I put on the Ruby Newbies group. If you can just Google it if you really want to find what the code was. But yeah, check it out, read the book, and if you want to get really know Ruby. Um, so, moving on, in 2 weeks, so my idea is, which I'm actually a little more excited to actually do these off weeks rather than doing the book weeks. I still want to get to the book, but I like the idea of reading actual libraries within Ruby and Rails. And I originally
Yeah, it's more exciting.
last week I originally mentioned the enumerable and reading that because it was more a Ruby library, and this is Ruby newbies. But I figured reading Rails libraries is actually probably more beneficial because more people actually probably are doing more Rails than they are Ruby. And the other fact is at the end we have a whole chapter coming up next week on enumerable, so it kind of would be double overkill to do a week on the enumerable library and then do another chapter on it. So it'd be pointless to do it twice. So I changed it up, and I would rather look at the active model library. So if you think of Rails, um, a lot of people have done Rails, but Rails is built on different libraries on itself. So Rails is the framework, I guess I should explain, is a framework for Ruby to easily write Ruby code and interactive web development. And one of the libraries within Rails, one of the main libraries, is active model. Um, a lot of the libraries actually start with the word active. So we have active controller, active model, active mailer, active. Yeah, they're all active. And there's a couple of them that aren't active, but I figured looking at an actual Rails library would be pretty cool to go through. And I looked at this one, and it's not that huge. And it goes over a lot of the concepts we went through in the last section with classes and modules. So next week we'll look at the active model library, and then also the active validator, which is actually a module of the active model library. I had a lot of work that I did a couple weeks ago with the validators and validating. I had to write my own validator for validating multiple emails, which was pretty interesting because I had to first read the active validator library to find out that they didn't have anything in place to handle active or arrays of emails. So I'll go in more detail about that next week, which will be fun, and then we'll play around with some stuff, and I'll maybe throw together a small Rails site, or I'll just use my site that I used last time. Regardless, we'll have some fun with that and kind of tinker with it, and we'll have a little more time to go through that. I won't be doing this at work like I did tonight. But and also another note, I'm actually going to take out the last section. So there's only 7 chapters left, and those 3 chapters are pretty deep subjects. So rather than throw in file and not really give much attention to it, I'm actually going to throw it with the last 4 chapters. So next week we'll actually go through 3 chapters instead of 4, and then the last week we will do 4 chapters, and then after that I think we'll probably just play around with some more looking through some modules, or maybe pick up another book. I'm thinking, I thought maybe Eloquent Ruby, but it seems like such a quick read that we could probably just go over it in 1 week. It's not necessary to go through all those concepts week by week. This book had more detailed information. Not to say that you shouldn't read that book, but I want to go through maybe a more intermediate book maybe next time. I'm thinking maybe the practice.
Yeah, or maybe we could just take out the best parts of the book.
Yeah, that's another idea. But yeah, hopefully I'll get more time this week, and I'll probably put out. Actually, I just want to read the last slide, and then we'll talk after. But just thank you again. Feel free to stay in chat, and that's my information. So I'll actually stop the recording because I tend to be rambling at the end. And see you later.